Hi everyone, this is Chapter 8 of Pride and Prejudice. In Chapter 7, Mrs. Bennet insists that Jane go to Netherfield on just a horse with no covering over her head because it's going to rain, and she hopes that Jane will get stuck there. Jane gets stuck in the rain and then gets a cold and then gets stuck at Netherfield basically until she recovers. Elizabeth goes to see her, walks over there despite there being a lot of mud. Mr. Darcy still thinks she looks pretty good though, and then she gets the invitation and then decides to stay also at Netherfield until Jane recovers. So they're all at Netherfield now. Chapter 8. At 5 o'clock, the two ladies retired to dress, and at 6:30, Elizabeth was summoned to dinner. To the civil inquiries which then poured in, and amongst which she had the pleasure of distinguishing the much superior solicitude of Mr. Bingley's, she could not make a very favourable answer. Jane was by no means better. The sisters, on hearing this, repeated 3 or 4 times how much they were grieved, how shocking it was to have a bad cold, and how excessively they disliked being ill themselves, and then thought no more of the matter. And their indifference towards Jane, when not immediately before them, restored Elizabeth to the enjoyment of all her original dislike. So in Chapter 7, when Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley, Caroline, both of them are Mr. Bingley's sisters, when they're with Jane and Elizabeth, they're very concerned about Jane's health and very friendly to Elizabeth, and Elizabeth actually starts to like them, like Jane does, because they seem so genuinely concerned about Jane and because they like Jane. But now that Jane's not in front of them, they kind of just offer these little pleasantries. Oh, it stinks to be sick. I hate being sick myself. It's awful that she's still feeling unwell. And then they just move on. So Elizabeth can tell that that's sort of insincere. When Jane isn't right in front of them, they don't really seem to care as much about her. So because of that, Elizabeth goes back to her original opinion and decides that she does not like them anymore, that they're fairly fake people. Their brother, indeed, was the only one of the party whom she could regard with any complacency. His anxiety for Jane was evident, and his attentions to herself most pleasing, and they prevented her feeling herself so much an intruder as she believed she was considered by the others. She had very little notice from any but him. Miss Bingley was engrossed by Mr. Darcy, her sister scarcely less so, and as for Mr. Hurst, by whom Elizabeth sat, he was an indolent man who lived only to eat, drink, and play at cards, who, when he found her prefer a dish to a plain ragout, had nothing to say to her. So Mr. Bingley, even though Jane is not anywhere near him, he's genuinely concerned about Jane's well-being. He's very nice and friendly to Elizabeth, so Elizabeth continues to like Mr. Bingley. Everyone else is not really concerned with Elizabeth, and Mr. Hurst, that's Mr. Bingley's brother-in-law, just cares about eating and playing cards and drinking, and that's about it. So she's feeling pretty uncomfortable. When dinner was over, she returned directly to Jane, and Miss Bingley began abusing her as soon as she was out of the room. Her manners were pronounced to be very bad indeed, a mixture of pride and impertinence. She had no conversation, no style, no taste, no beauty. Mrs. Hurst thought the same and added, "She has nothing in short to recommend her, but being an excellent walker. I shall never forget her appearance this morning. She really looked almost wild." "She did indeed, Louisa. I could hardly keep my countenance. Very nonsensical to come at all. Why must she be scampering about the country because her sister had a cold? Her hair so untidy, so blousy." So by abusing her, Jane Austen means that as soon as Elizabeth leaves the room to go see Jane and make sure she's all right, Caroline just starts digging into her. Louisa, Mrs. Hurst, the other sister, agrees with her, and they're just complaining about Elizabeth and how she has no style and no class, and how could she walk all this way just because her sister has a cold. So Elizabeth pretty accurately predicts that they're two-faced people. "Yes, and her petticoat. I hope you saw her petticoat. 6 inches deep in mud, I am absolutely certain. And the gown which had been let down to hide it is not doing its office." So your petticoat was basically your underskirt. So you'd wear your petticoat, and then over that you'd wear your nicer dress. So they're saying, "Oh my God, we can see the mud on her petticoat, and the dress isn't covering it up. She looks like a mess." "Your picture may be very exact, Louisa," said Bingley, But this was all lost upon me. I thought Miss Elizabeth Bennet looked remarkably well when she came into the room this morning. Her dirty petticoat quite escaped my notice. You observed it, Mr. Darcy, I am sure, said Miss Bingley, and I am inclined to think that you would not wish to see your sister make such an exhibition. Certainly not. To walk 3 miles or 4 miles or 5 miles or whatever it is, above her ankles in dirt, and alone, quite alone. What could she mean by it? It seems to me to show an abominable sort of conceited independence, a most country town indifference to decorum. It shows an affection for her sister that is very pleasing, said Bingley. So Mr. Bingley is actually stepping up and defending Elizabeth's actions and saying, it shows how much he cares about Jane, which isn't a bad thing. I'm afraid, Mr. Darcy, observed Miss Bingley in a half-whisper, that this adventure has rather affected your admiration of her fine eyes. Not at all, he replied. They were brightened by the exercise. So Carolyn tries to dig into, Mr. Darcy's crush on Elizabeth, and he's just like, no, her eyes look still pretty good. A short pause followed the speech, and Mrs. Hurst began again. I have an excessive regard for Jane Bennet. She is really a very sweet girl, and I wish with all my heart she were well settled. But with such a father and mother, and such low connections, I am afraid there is no chance of it. I think I have heard you say that their uncle is an attorney in Meryton? Yes, and they have another who lives somewhere near Cheapside. That is capital, added her sister, and they both laughed heartily. If you remember, we talked about Sir William Lucas earning his own money. The Bingleys also don't come from such, an aristocratic background. They're still noble and they're still wealthy, but part of their money has been earned as well. So the Bingley sisters, somewhat hypocritically, are also digging in to the Bennets for having family that earns a living instead of just inheriting money. So we kind of see that play out, those class tensions with our characters. If they had uncles enough to fill all Cheapside, cried Bingley, it would not make them one jot less agreeable. So Bingley's saying, I don't care where their relatives live or what they do, they're still very nice, agreeable, friendly people. But it must very materially lessen their chance of marrying men of any consideration in the world, replied Darcy. So Darcy's agreeing now with Mr. Bingley's sisters and saying it's going to be harder for them to marry well with that sort of a background and those family circumstances. To this speech, Bingley made no answer, but his sisters gave it their hearty assent, and indulged their mirth for some time at the expense of their dear friend's vulgar relations. So they're just, mirth is laughter, is like making fun of someone in this case. So they just keep making fun of Jane. Jane Austen is being a little sarcastic by saying they're dear friends. So Jane really can't matter that much to the Bingley sisters if they're making fun of her family the second someone is out of the room. With a renewal of tenderness, however, they repaired to her room on leaving the dining parlor, and sat with her till summoned to coffee. So, very two-faced characters. Elizabeth leaves, they make fun of the whole Bennet family, and then they go up and spend time with Jane and act perfectly nice. She was still very poorly, and Elizabeth would not quit her at all till late in the evening, when she had the comfort of seeing her asleep, and when it appeared to her rather right than pleasant that she should go downstairs herself. On entering the drawing-room, she found the whole party at loo, card game, and was immediately invited to join them. But suspecting them to be playing high, she declined it, and making her sister the excuse, she would amuse herself for the short time she could stay below, with a book. Mr. Hurst looked at her with astonishment. Do you prefer reading to cards, said he? That is rather singular. Singular in this case means individual or weird, basically. Miss Eliza Bennet, said Miss Bingley, despises cards. She is a great reader, and has no pleasure in anything else. I deserve neither such praise nor such censure, cried Elizabeth. I am not a great reader, and I have pleasure in many things. In nursing your sister, I am sure you have pleasure, said Bingley, and I hope it will soon be increased by seeing her quite well. Elizabeth thanked him from her heart, and then walked towards a table where a few books were lying. He immediately offered to fetch her others, all that his library afforded. And I wish my collection were larger for your benefit and my own credit, but I am an idle fellow, and though I have not many, I have more than I ever look into. Elizabeth assured him that she could suit herself perfectly with those in the room. I am astonished, said Miss Bingley, that my father should have left so small a collection of books. What a delightful library you have at Pemberley, Mr. Darcy. Pemberley is Mr. Darcy's house. It ought to be good, he replied. It has been the work of many generations. And then you have added so much to it yourself. You are always buying books. I cannot comprehend the neglect of a family library in such days as these. Neglect? I am sure you neglect nothing that can add to the beauties of that noble place. Charles, when you build your house, I wish it may be half as delightful as Pemberley. So that's Caroline Bingley speaking, and Charles is Mr. Bingley's first name, which we only find out now, but that's Charles Bingley. I wish it may. But I would really advise you to make your purchase in that neighborhood, and take Pemberley for a kind of model. There is not a finer county in England than Derbyshire. With all my heart, I will buy Pemberley itself if Darcy will sell it. I am talking of possibilities, Charles. Upon my word, Caroline, I should think it more possible to get Pemberley by purchase than by imitation. Elizabeth was so much caught by what passed as to leave her very little attention for her book, and soon laying it wholly aside, she drew near the card table and stationed herself between Mr. Bingley and his eldest sister to observe the game. Is Miss Darcy much grown since the spring? Said Miss Bingley. Will she be as tall as I am? I think she will. She is now about Miss Elizabeth Bennet's height, or rather taller. How I long to see her again. I never met with anybody who delighted me so much. Such a countenance, such manners, and so extremely accomplished for her age. Her performance on the pianoforte is exquisite. It is amazing to me, said Bingley, how young ladies can have patience to be so very accomplished as they all are. All young ladies accomplished? My dear Charles, what do you mean? Yes, all of them, I think. They all paint tables, cover screens, and net purses. I scarcely know anyone who cannot do all this, and I am sure I never heard a young lady spoken of for the first time without being informed that she was very accomplished. Your list of the common extent of accomplishments, said Darcy, has too much truth. The word is applied to many a woman who deserves it no otherwise than by netting a purse or covering a screen. But I am very far from agreeing with you in your estimation of ladies in general. I cannot boast of knowing more than half a dozen in the whole range of my acquaintance that are really accomplished. Nor I am sure, said Miss Bingley. So they're talking about all of the, qualities and traits that a woman at that time, an upper class woman or even a middle class woman, would be expected to have. So embroidering, sewing, music, usually speaking another language, oftentimes French, was considered all the traits of an accomplished lady. And Mr. Bingley says, wow, I can't believe all these women know how to do all these things. That's great. And Mr. Darcy says, oh, there's just a laundry list of, random accomplishments. You have to be, really very skilled to be truly considered accomplishment. I don't know more than half a dozen, so I don't know more than 6 women who I would say are really accomplished. And then Caroline Bingley, very predictably, with her own sort of snobby background, agrees with him and says, oh yes, there's very few of us who are actually accomplished. Then, observed Elizabeth, you must comprehend a great deal in your idea of an accomplished woman. Yes, I do comprehend a great deal in it. Oh, certainly, cried his faithful assistant. No one can be really esteemed accomplished who does not greatly surpass what is usually met with. So his assistant in this case is Caroline Bingley. She's sort of just nodding and agreeing with whatever Mr. Darcy says. A woman must have a thorough knowledge of music, singing, drawing, dancing, and the modern languages to deserve the world. And besides all this, she must possess a certain something in her air and manner of walking, the tone of her voice, her address and expressions, or the word will be but half deserved. All this she must possess, added Darcy, and to all this she must yet add something more substantial, in the improvement of her mind by extensive reading. I am no longer surprised at your knowing only 6 accomplished women. I rather wonder at your knowing any. We don't have a dialogue tag for that, but because of our character's views in this whole conversation, we know that it's Elizabeth speaking. So she's saying, wow, now it's amazing that you know anyone who fits this ridiculous list of accomplishments. Are you so severe upon your own sex as to doubt the possibility of all this? I never saw such a woman. I never saw such capacity, and taste and application and elegance as you describe united. So Elizabeth says your expectations are really unrealistic. Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley both cried out against the injustice of her implied doubt, and were both protesting that they knew many women who answered this description, when Mr. Hurst called them to order with bitter complaints of their inattention to what was going forward. As all the conversation was thereby at an end, Elizabeth soon afterwards left the room. "Eliza Bennet," said Miss Bingley, when the door was closed on her, "is one of those young ladies who seek to recommend themselves to the other sex by undervaluing their own. And with many men, I dare say, it succeeds. But, in my opinion, it is a paltry device, a very mean art." So again, as soon as Elizabeth leaves the room, Austen says, as soon as when the door was closed on her, so she's just walked out, the door shuts, already Caroline Bingley starts complaining about her again. And she says that she's just trying to show how good she is by, undervaluing all women, which is not really what Elizabeth's doing at all. She's pointing out the problem with Mr. Darcy's expectations more than anything. "Undoubtedly," replied Darcy, to whom this remark was chiefly addressed, "there is meanness in all the arts which ladies sometimes condescend to employ for captivation. Whatever bears affinity to cunning is despicable." Miss Bingley was not so entirely satisfied with this reply as to continue the subject. So it kind of seems like Mr. Darcy is kind of just stopping her from talking also. He's saying, anything that involves cunning or is nasty just to get someone's attention is not really okay. So I think he's kind of pointing out, you're not doing a great job either. The second someone leaves, you just start complaining about them and it's not going to work. Elizabeth joined them again, only to say that her sister was worse and that she could not leave her. Bingley urged Mr. Jones's being sent for immediately, while his sisters, convinced that no country advice could be of any service, recommended and expressed to town for one of the most eminent physicians. A physician would be closer to our doctor nowadays. This she would not hear of, but she was not so unwilling to comply with their brother's proposal, and it was settled that Mr. Jones should be sent for early in the morning, if Miss Bennet were not decidedly better. Bingley was quite uncomfortable. His sisters declared that they were miserable. They solaced their wretchedness, however, by duets after supper, while he could find no better relief to his feelings than by giving his housekeeper directions that every possible attention might be paid to the sick lady and her sister. Just note in that last paragraph of the chapter, pay attention to the language Austen is using to describe these characters. Sometimes it's very subtle, but it really does show you a lot about them. So she writes that Bingley was quite uncomfortable. So he's very uncomfortable. That's his emotional state. That's it. There's no wiggle room in interpreting that. His sisters declared that they were miserable, though. So they're saying that they're miserable, but that doesn't mean that they actually are. So that's just a little language thing that you want to, watch for things like that as you keep reading. And our next sentence is sort of tongue-in-cheek, sarcastic as well. They solaced their wretchedness, however, by duets after supper. So they fixed feeling wretched, and Jane Austen is using an overly dramatic word to show that that's not truly how they feel. So they just sing together and everything is fine. Mr. Bingley is clearly more distressed. His actions are to give his housekeeper directions that every possible attention might be paid to the sick lady, Jane, and her sister. So he actually goes to one of the servants and says, whatever they need, whatever they want, just do it and make sure that they're okay. So very clear contrast with how these characters feel and how they treat others. Watch for that in a book like this, which is a novel of manners. Very much about how characters treat others and not just how one behaves and carries themselves, not just about things like table manners and saying please and thank you, but what actions one actually does to other people to show that they care about other people, or in other cases to show that they don't care or are apathetic. And that is chapter 8.